Okay, so about the university trying to plug in on some of the questions that have been discussed also this morning. And I'm going to read a bit and then comment also over the slides. So recent debates over the fate of the university during and possibly after the COVID-19 crisis have focused overwhelmingly on technological solutions to challenges posed by digital education and distant learning. The crisis of institutionalized pedagogical models sparked by mobility and physical assembly restriction and the perspective of rapid technological development have defined an increasingly polarized debate among faculty, students, and university management. Much of the debate revolved around the idea of the loss of the university site as a physical space. The idea of a loss of university sites rather than concentrating on the physical space can point us also to reflect upon an impasse that we faced in identifying the site for critical intervention in respect to the current transformation the institution of the university is undergoing. In order to regain such a site, I propose that we begin by searching for its margins or borders. Therefore, the two questions: what are the digital walls or borders of the university, and what remain of the figure of the border once we enter the virtual realm? In this short presentation, I would like to put forward an hypothesis that the COVID-19 crisis has drastically accelerated the process of reconfiguration of borders between the university and its outside. In this scenario, the walls of the university are thresholds discriminating between the external and internal in separate parts, and principle delegated to units of artificial measure, metrics that we've mentioned also today. Metrics that organize the social division of labor and continuously retrace boundaries between the foreign and the edge. So if we start by looking at or think about the various environment in which distant learning in higher education take place, we could identify, or we could start to question the idea of space again from the idea of its borders. We all had the opportunity during the last 2 years to participate in multiple classes and seminars, perhaps to perform simultaneously across different institutions and national borders, simply by connecting remotely from our laptops to providers such Blackboard, Zoom, Cisco WebEx, Jitsi, Google, and so on. There has been much debate around the question whether online mode of working and education is fostering actually academic cooperation or not. But I don't intend to promote here, for the benefit of corporate interests, a comparative approach over the specific merits and limits of such platforms. One could instead superficially start to recognize that classes organized by Cambridge, Columbia, or any top-ranking university and minor public institutions located in the peripheries seems to take place apparently in the same working environment and according to the same digital working conditions. Indeed, this is only a very superficial analysis, which is failing in identifying differences in the social and contractual definition of one's own working environment. Two questions arise here. How much of the physical architecture of a school was a representation of the social and contractual condition which is hosted? And how much this concealing behind digital walls is intentional in restructuring the working condition and pushing forward a neoliberal agenda? I put here, mention briefly, an image of Stuart Hall at the Open University, just as a reminder that distant learning is not an idea that can completely be subsumed within Silicon Valley projects. Instead, we had an early development of an idea of open and distant university also taking place in England under the push of the Labour Party. You know? The issue of labor has always been at the center also there. The debate about what lies behind the technological-driven restructuring of the university dates back at least the late 1990s, when David Noel voiced his concern over the commodification of higher education in North America. I quote, "What is driving this headlong rush to implement new technology with so little deliberation on the pedagogical and economic costs at the risk of students and faculty alienation and opposition? A short answer might be the fear of getting left behind, the incessant pressure of progress. But there is more to it. For the university are not simply undergoing a technological transformation. Beneath that change and camouflaged by it lies another, the commercialization of higher education. For here, as elsewhere, technology is but a vehicle of disarm and disguise. This is a quite apocalyptic, let's say, description of technology and education. So almost a decade later, in his article, The Informal Economy of the Information University, Marc Bousque corrects Nobel's thesis by shifting focus from the issue of a commodified product of knowledge to the condition of its production. According to Bousque, Nobel correctly identified that technological change provides a vector through which management can impose reductions in the workplace autonomy and control. Yet, Nobel's critique lagged behind because it precisely focused on the transmission of course content over distance, without accounting for the experience of knowledge production, but the precarious and flexible workforce of academic laborers that are produced in the same process. In Bousque's words, which I quote, which is to say that our motivation for opposing the commodification of education can never be only the degree to which commodified education is better or worse than non-commodified education, but this intrinsically associated question of the degree to which commodification represents the increased exploitation of living labor. And I will go back also to this question later. Now, if we attempt to translate to nowadays some of the questions that were posed by Nobel and Bousque on the specific, let's say, time of the COVID-19 crisis, there are certain remarks that we can do. First of all, it's remarkable how the process of catching up or not being left behind with a model which is mostly the one of the American university is still a powerful force in education policies across national borders. The sudden requirement to move academic activities online following the outbreak of the pandemic has brought institutions to adopt technological solutions such as video conference platforms that were already available and tested on the market. Reinforcing therefore the ideology of a knowledge transfer or science, technology, and innovation transferred from innovation centers to periphery, with the saving mission of rescuing education institutions from their own eclipse. And this transfer, of course, it's always not only a transfer of technology, but it's also associated with a transfer of a certain knowledge, management knowledge, or how to organize labor and division of labor. Secondly, we should acknowledge that the role that specific national and regional policies have played in facilitating this transfer. For example, by accelerating the requirement to adapt to the online model with government degree coming out in rapid succession, which resulted in university buying-in solution already available. Here we should pay attention to the diversification and the specificity of government responses, which does not allow for an undifferentiated and unifying discourse. In this sense, the digitalization of the university is far from an online translation, which has nothing to do anymore with territorial sovereignty. Third, along the historical demands of right to education and upwards class mobility, new concerns regarding the establishment of a healthy, safe teaching learning environment have been playing a major role in the reconfiguration of the university as we know it, creating widespread consensus around distant learning practices. So the closest precedent in Europe, at least to such an epochal change in higher education, can be traced back to the 1999 reforms introduced by the Bologna Declaration. I consider them as a regional response to the new public management policy trend. A plurality of national metrics were translated into a common credit system, European Credit Transfer and Accumulation System, with the intent to foster a mobility scheme for students and faculty members across institution and national borders. Implementing a mobility scheme was considered like a key feature to achieve employability and match the demands of the labor market. With the outbreak of the health crisis, the same scheme was heavily undermined. While university expected drastic decrease in students' mobility, uncertainty surrounds the prospects of international students coming from regions other than Europe. Following the outbreak of the pandemic, the European Commission called for digital transformation of higher education by way of deeper institutional cooperation, implementation of digital governance tools, clear and automatic procedure of credit recognitions, virtual campuses, and blended mobility for all students and staff. Among the challenges posed by the sudden closure of national borders, we certainly need to account for the crisis of the European project of international integration as a leading force for driving the reconfiguration of the university. It isn't therefore surprising that much effort is currently undertaken in order to re-engineer academic mobility in the digital realm. At stake is not only the prestige and the economies of institutions of higher education, but also the very project of shaping the citizen of the communitarian area. Taking exam the position of international and overseas students could foster therefore a discussion not only on the possibility of the universities to survive the crisis, but also to question once more the pedagogical mission of the logic of such institutions. Highlighting challenges and problematics faced by international and exchange students. So the question of mobility during the crisis does not mean to assume their point of view as a privileged position of observation on the university, because it is anyhow the point of view of a small elite, let's say, that is allowed to move and also has the financial resources to do that. Nor to establish an homology between their experience of border crossing and that of other groups of migrants. Nevertheless, it's important to recognize how universities in Europe and even more in the US have long survived on the appropriation and incorporation of externalities from foreign countries, mostly those defined as anthropological areas, both in terms of economical resources. And in spite of the different funding model, this is both true for public and private institutions, and in terms of knowledge capital. In 2003, in the context of the globalization of higher education, Aura Hong suggested that an American educated foreign is the kind of global citizen that has the capacity to translate values across cultural contexts and different regime of worth. The quality of risk-taking, mobile knowledge, free-floating individuals are those most in demand for the training and the making of entrepreneurial subjects capable to act in a globalized space. And here I look at a couple of case studies. So in current research pilot projects, such as the one of Open Virtual Mobility, which is supported by the Erasmus Plus program, the concept of cross-border movement is replaced by the participation to online classes and group activities organized by institutions abroad. This is less significant on the side of making up for the experience of living in a different region, country, or continent as an irreplaceable opportunity for learning outside of the class framework once inserted into different cultural and social contexts. We could well say that virtual mobility is in fact no mobility at all. Rather, the outcome of this effort to extend or replace, in case of impossibility, physical mobility with a partial surrogate of it in the virtual realm might have the most significant effects on the reconfiguration of the university as an institution on the long term. Among the key concerns with the Open Virtual Mobility project was to establish a set of non-cognitive skills and competencies that would be able to map and define qualities that are required for participating in activities situated in online, working, or studying international contexts. These soft skills or non-cognitive skills includes intercultural skills and attitudes, network learning, active self-regulated learning skills, media and digital literacy, autonomy-driven learning, interactive and collaborative learning in an authentic international environment, and of course, open-mindedness. So this set of soft skill or non-cognitive competencies required also the definition of a new metric system that was especially crafted for evaluating and measuring personal inclination and interpersonal attitudes. They are often unrecognized or under-recognized by formal degrees and certification, such as the credit system that we have in place. For the purpose of verifying and evaluating informal and non-formal learning, this certification relies on the Open Badge standard that was initiated by the Mozilla Foundation in 2011. Among the key features of these metrics is the possibility of constructing an alignment between credentials and learning outcomes. I quote, "The problem of alignment of competencies in the context of open badges has been the ambiguity of competencies descriptions and the lack of semantic metadata of competency frameworks," end of quote. To enable cross-references between different competency frameworks and to account for the competency definition to change over time, for example. So new competencies will rise in popularity and other competencies will fade. The Open Virtual Mobility project proposes to consolidate semantics by cross-references the European Skills, Competencies and Occupation Framework, also called ESCO. This would allow machine learning reading to deduct similarities and to detect connection from one competency definition to another. The purpose of annotating digital credentials, such as open badges, by adding metadata is to improve the algorithm ability to recommend learning paths which better align with the current trends of the labor market. Since 2017, the European Commission has made available the European Skills, Competencies and Occupation Framework Dictionary, searchable in 27 languages. ESCO is a taxonomy describing, identifying and classifying professional occupation and skills relevant for the European labor markets and education and training institutions. Among the purposes of this taxonomy is to help education and training providers to understand what skills the labor market needs. They can adapt the curricula accordingly to prepare the students better for tomorrow's labor market. That's their statement. The maintenance of this taxonomy was recently implemented through the use of representation learning technique and data-driven AI approach, whose role was to consolidate the consistency of labels and semantics and put them in relation with terms such as, for example, senior, fixed term, or part-time, so something that doesn't have to do with the specific competencies, but with the length or the condition in which the specific skill is performed. In times of COVID-19, we assist to the growing reliance of educational institutions over indexes intended to measure in real time the fluctuation of the labor market. According to Ben Williamson, I quote, "If earlier higher education reform has focused on widening access and improving academic success, today's demand-driven education will focus more strongly than ever on ensuring graduates are job-ready and have access to rewarding careers over the course of their lifetime," end of quote. In such scenario, the AI-driven approach to the university reforms seems to focus strongly on establishing a real-time translatability among different demands within a single tool of governance. These demands include a more flexible and timely distribution of the workforce, evaluating capacity to adapt to a mobile working condition, upwards class mobility, restructuring of university curricula according to their performance and success rates, and the demand for safe and healthy learning working environments. Now some points or some conclusion or some question that I would like to put on the table. There is a series of consideration and questions that we can raise about the intention to bridge education, skills, and labor market in such a way, with the implication of collapse in the digital walls which separate the university and the market, studying and working, production and reproduction. Perhaps could be useful to restart from an although arbitrary but nevertheless meaningful differentiation between what is a skill and what is knowledge. If skills are those competencies that can be exchanged for retribution on the labor market, knowledge has more to do with forming and framing a vision of the world. The transition from a knowledge society to a society based on the supply and demand of skills and competencies account for parceling out of work into molecular and separate functions and tasks. We are told in these that professions such as the geographer or choreographer, and I take these two examples because they are among the one reference in the ESCO documentation that I've analyzed. So geographer and choreographers as profession with a situated knowledge and a specific vision of the world, managing and orchestrating high level of complexities may no longer exist in the future. A second question I would like to raise has to do with student satisfaction. I don't think it's possible to reduce the desire connected with studying at the university with a question of job readiness or employability. Even if we account for the social responsibility of the university to not produce a mass of unemployed, which means preparing students for professions that are no longer in demand, we have to recognize that upwards mobility does not correspond only to financial income, but also to social status, which is connected to networks and knowledge. Even bringing back some of the concern expressed by Bousque in 2010 about how commodified education always corresponds to an increasing exploitation of living labor, we might cast some doubts about the actual financial promise that this demand-driven education model is actually making to prospect students. Eventually, also, inclusivity is a buzzword which is resonating a lot around these days. So the possibility of, a virtual mobility as the promise of something that could be included for every student participating at the university and not only to a selected elite. But I have my doubts about this definition. And I like to use Gayatri Spivak's remark in 1993 already that as the margins or the outside enters an institution or teaching machine, the kind of teaching machine they enter will determine also their form. We should better understand also how virtual mobility is linked to other forms of physical mobility or immobility. It's interesting to notice, and I close with this remark, that analysis of the job of the labor market or the job market based on the ESCO taxonomy, they are also made outside the borders of the European Union. Has been the case, for example, of Ukraine, Tunisia, and Chile already. The question here is how the demands that are expressed from the European labor market will influence also the curricula of education institutions outside the communitarian space. We know that these days, the second part of this COVID pandemic, there's been a lot of debate about what jobs they are needed and how the European market will actually work in order to kind of provide this figure. And has been taught a lot in connection with nursing, for example, or other kinds of jobs. But I think that this will slowly be applied also to those skills that can be imported in a dimension of virtual mobility while keeping actually students and professionals, former students and new professionals in their national territory. So it's interesting for me to think how a taxonomy that is kind of analyzing the markets inside Europe has been immediately projected also on the outside and is affecting also on the outside. I think I close here for now.